It says it's live streaming. All right. It says it right there. Sweet. Okay, let me pull up my notes here. Welcome, everybody, to another amazing, lively episode of Church History for Lunch. Who we got here today? We got a few of you. Mark, Michaela, what's up? Gabriel. Hey, what's going on? All right. Today we're talking about we're fast forwarding about 1,000 years from like 1,200 years from where we were. We're going up to the medieval time period, and we're going to sort of take a second look at a story a lot of Christians think that they fully understand. And there's a lot more context to it, as there always is in church history. So today we're talking about Luther's 95 Theses. Hey, anybody confirm that we're on Facebook at all?
Yes.
We are?
We're on Facebook.
Hey, that's never worked before. I'm glad it's working. Sweet. I can't read any comments, so if we're on there, whatever. All right. So we're going to start. I got about an hour. There's a lot of material. A lot of this came from an essay I wrote about the historical context of the 95 Theses. There's a lot more going on in the background. We have this sort of romantic beginning. Here, I'm going to share my screen, and I'll show you some pictures here. iPad, is this working? Do you see that? Anybody?
Yes.
Okay, good. This here is, people call it Wittenberg. It's Wittenberg, the Wittenberg Castle Church in Germany, in the town of Wittenberg. And there's this sort of romantic picture that people have. This is the church door, and in this romantic picture, that's right, it has the watermark on it from the website I stole it from. And in this romantic picture, you have Luther walking up and nailing this thing to the door. He's studying the proclamations of the Pope and the doctrines of the church, and he's really mad, and and he's particularly furious about indulgences, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But he's really mad, and he walks up to the church. He writes this thesis, 95 problems he has with indulgences, 95 sort of theses, arguments that he has against it, why they shouldn't exist, why they should end. And he walks up to the door, gets a hammer and a nail, and he pounds these things to the door, right, in utter defiance of the papacy, right? And as we tell the story, it's like this action of like fervor and zeal and bravery. And modern scholarship has revealed like a lot more about this episode than meets the eye. This is sort of the romanticized version of it. There's a lot more going on. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. First off, I want to point out nailing something to the door at the Wittenberg Castle Church was not a rebellious thing to do. It was actually like a community corkboard. I mean, there was probably stuff all over it. There was people. It was a way that you would engage people in conversation. He's a professor, and he goes down there and he says, "I'm going to host a conversation about indulgences, and I have some problems with it. And here's the topics I would like to discuss." And it's a way of inviting everyone into a conversation. He likely had no idea at first that this would have been this thing that would make the Pope mad. He likely thought this could happen in support of the Pope, that he could talk about these things and the archbishops would be fine. And he could just, and this is how you had conversations, theological conversations back then. So there's actually, I'm not sure how far to go into this, but there's actually some evidence that this episode itself may not have happened. We do know that on the day he is supposed to have nailed this to the door, a copy of it was sent to the Archbishop of Mainz, and that's kind of an interesting thing right there. And we do know that the eyewitness that says that he nailed it to the door actually wasn't even in that town for a few more years. But I'm willing to go with it because it's not a big deal. I want to talk about indulgences because this is what he's writing about. He's writing against indulgences. And I don't have time to read into all the problems with indulgences today, but there's this, the nature of Luther's letter is strictly about the Catholic doctrine of indulgences. And if you're not familiar with indulgences they originated with the penance practices of Western Christianity in the Middle Ages. Penance was something that Luther believed. That's something he was good with. Penance was sort of this way of making spiritual reparations, where a fallen Christian could atone for the sins that they had committed. Sometimes they would, pray a certain amount of prayer. Sometimes they would serve the city in some way. Sometimes they would make a donation, sell some things, change something, all kinds of ways you can make reparations in the ancient world, confession and prayers and serving of the church. That all kinds of ways that you could atone for sins and sort of come back into good standing with God and the church. And originally, hey, Daniel, do me a favor, mute your mic over there for me. Getting a lot of noise. And so originally that was fine. Originally the papacy taught that backslidden Christians could be absolved and restored to the fellowship after displaying sorrow, and then either pray or make a pilgrimage, give alms, or make some kind of payment to the church. And Luther doesn't seem to have a problem with that in particular. The doctrine of penance was eventually, it was fully developed by Thomas Aquinas, great leader in the early Catholic Church. And Thomas Aquinas believed the Pope could dispense indulgences from the church treasury of merit. It's sort of this kind of spiritual bank account that they sort of, that's a good metaphor for it, that when Jesus died on the cross, so like the merit filled the spiritual bank account in the Pope's, and he could give sort of indulgences, overflow of grace to people who were making penance, and that's fine. And that's what Thomas Aquinas taught. And eventually, Thomas Aquinas determined in one of his writings that indulgences actually could also be applied on behalf of the dead who are already in purgatory. Okay, and even more, that these indulgences could be performed without a contrite heart. That someone could basically, if you lost a family member, you could go down and they were in purgatory because you just knew them. They were in purgatory. You could go down and you could pay. You didn't have to have a contrite heart or anything. You could just pay and shorten the time in their time in purgatory for however much you had paid. That's how much would be taken off. And Aquinas kind of opens the door for this. And in 1476, Pope Sixtus IV issued a papal decree. He essentially makes the transfer of indulgences from one person to another good. Like you could take your indulgences and give them to another. So like this opens the door for this whole thing. Now, this is what Luther was against. It's interesting because Luther wasn't the only one that was against this. It's not like Luther woke up one day and said, this is wrong. People had problems with this for a long time. You have John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, Johann Ruckeret, Wesel, and Wesel Gansfort. Like even, Catherine of Siena, I even held a lot of the same doctrines that Luther did. And some of them were killed off and some of them were just left alone. Nobody really cared that a lot of Christian theologians disagreed with indulgences. And that's the interesting thing, is that suddenly, when Luther goes to talk about this in a classroom, suddenly people care. And the question is like, why do people suddenly care that Luther did this? Like, what is the mechanism that suddenly made people be like, yeah, you know what? Like, I'm with him. For all the people that have written about this, why now? Okay. That's what we're talking about today. That's the context I want to get into here. So the simple fact that there had long been objections to, prior to Luther, of indulgences is an interesting question. So I want to talk first off about some of the hidden elements of the Reformation. There's four in particular. There's a plague. There's an archbishop. There's a man named Johann Tetzel. He's a salesman. And then there's Frederick the Wise of Saxony. These four things, if you understand these four things, you will understand what's going on with why people suddenly care about Luther's 95 Theses about this topic, okay? Excuse me. So let's talk about the plague. In decades leading up to 1517 is the year that Luther puts this thing on the door, there was a plague, a virulent strain of plague called the bubonic plague, also known as Black Death. That's what they called it back then. Here, I can stop sharing my screen for a second here and get some FaceTime. And this plague ravaged the continent and of Europe. And it was, its particular strain killed 60 to 80% of those who were infected by it. And the inhabitants of Europe were actually particularly frightened. There had been a lot of plagues. They were particularly frightened of this strain of virus, this plague, because it killed really quickly. Like really quickly. You got it, no signs, and then you died in a matter of like sometimes the same day. And that combined with France, Italy, and Spain and Germany, all combined, they lost over 4 million people. And there was a lot less people in the continent back then. 4 million people is a lot of people. So 4 million people had died leading up to Luther's 95 Theses being written. And mortality rates were incredibly high. So with mortality rates this high, everyone knows somebody who has lost somebody, or everybody knows somebody who has died from the bubonic plague, from the Black Death. Excuse me. And I've been talking a lot on Zoom today. This is like hour number 3. And so everybody knew somebody who was supposedly in purgatory that they were worried about. Okay. This right here opens the door for indulgences to be sold. Everybody knows somebody who has died. Okay. Nearly entirely, the entire population knows somebody. A loved one has passed away. And so the market for selling indulgences begins to skyrocket. Oh, what's going on, Chris? How you doing, man? So they come to the Catholic Church, and they come to the church, and because they are devout Catholics, they're people of the church, and so they come to the church seeking to help those whom they have lost, and to bring them sort of into heaven earlier. And so they're more than willing to pay. And so the sale of indulgences starts to go through the roof. Now, there's a brand new archbishop. His name is Albrecht. He's the Archbishop of Mainz. Oh, here, let me share my screen again and show you some fun pictures. Here, let me get this moving. All right. This guy, right here. This is the Archbishop of Mainz, Albrecht. And he's the guy who on the day, October 31st, 1517, he receives a copy of Luther's 95 Theses that same day, the day that it is supposed to also have been nailed to the door. Okay. Suspicious. Yes. Now, his name was Albrecht. He had just become the archbishop, and interesting things about him. He was too young to become the archbishop, and he wasn't even qualified. He hadn't been ordained. And so he didn't qualify for the position, but he was from a very rich family called the Hausdorfer, and I don't remember. It starts with an H. It's a long word. A very rich, influential German family for a very long time. He's a member of this family, and they wanted him on that seat as archbishop because it was the most powerful seat in the land in that time, in that particular area. And so they worked out through a friendship with Pope Leo. Let me show you Pope Leo. This guy's Pope Leo. They work out a deal with Pope Leo that they will make a massive donation to Pope Leo if Albrecht can sit on the seat of Archbishop of Mainz. And the Pope is interested because the Pope is actually trying to build, at that time, St. Peter's Basilica, which still stands today, a massive building project. He also had several wars he's trying to pay for. He's running out of money. So he's got to build this basilica. And so this wealthy family wants their son sitting on the chair of the archbishop. And so they go to Leo and they say, hey, we'll make a sizable donation if you will have our boy Albrecht, if you let him, Albie, sit on the throne there. And he basically says, okay. And they work out a deal. It's an interesting contract that they worked out. It did put Albrecht heavily into debt. However, it also written in this contract was it included a secret deal that allowed for the sale of indulgences throughout his particular territory. And all the money that came from the sale of indulgences in his territory would be split between Albrecht and Pope Leo, for Albrecht to pay back his debts and then build wealth, and Pope Leo to build St. Peter's Basilica and wage some wars that he wanted to wage. All right. Super shady. Nevertheless, that's kind of how things worked back then. So this happens. And then Albrecht, he's like, yes, now I can sell indulgences. And so now he needs a salesman. And there's this guy, Johann Tetzel. He is here's his picture. These guys are all huge, like big dudes. They're wealthy. They eat good. He was a shrewd marketer. He was a German Dominican priest, a passionate preacher. And it turns out that he was always preaching about indulgences, like constantly. Are we? Did I? Hold on a second. Oh yeah, we're good. Always constantly preaching about indulgences, and he makes a lot of money off indulgences. Okay. There's even like letters where the archbishop like scolds him for spending so much in his travels, and his entourage. They're spending ridiculous amounts of money. He's like, "Yo, chill out. We're trying to bank some here. You're spending it all." And so Johann Tetzel has this phrase that he comes up with, this little song that he would sing to get the peasants to give money to the church, to get their relatives whom they had lost and loved during the plague out of purgatory. And the song goes like this. I don't know how the melody was, but it's, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Okay. Put that to music. You've got a catchy tune. And Luther hates this guy. Luther. So when you're writing these documents in the medieval period, you would talk about people, but you wouldn't name them, because if you name them, you're actually making them more famous. And so in one of his arguments, in one of the 95 Theses, he mentions this sort of song that Tetzel was singing, and as a way of saying, like, this is terrible. Like, this guy's full of crap. Now, so Luther can't stand this, and Luther's lashing out against this, okay? So you have these three people in play. You have somebody heavily in debt, he hires Tetzel to sell indulgences all in the land, and he gets to split the indulgences with the Pope. Everybody's getting rich doing this, okay? Obviously corrupt. Now, there's one more person who enters in. His name is Frederick the Wise, they called him. He was the Elector of Saxony. His father was the Elector as well. And he was in charge of the Wittenberg Castle. Like, that was in his jurisdiction. And he was always, so he's basically over Luther's area. Luther is a professor there. So he's over Luther's area. He's a person who is sort of anti-expansionist, because the Pope is always trying to expand his land, his rule. So he wants Albrecht to take control of more dioceses. He can collect more indulgences and send more money around. And so you have Frederick in the middle, but all around him on his east and his west, you have Albrecht, who's gaining more and more dioceses, taking control of these things, and he's closing in on the property on Saxony, on Wittenberg especially, where Prince Frederick is sitting on the throne there. And so he's fighting against the expansion of the authority of the Pope, and he's always being surrounded on east and west by Albrecht, who's taking more and more of the diocese around, and the walls are closing in on this guy, and he wants to do something to stop it. Okay, now he's also. Hey, mute your microphone for me there. Whoever's around here, maybe I can just do it for you. Hold on. Mute all. Boom. Done. Now. One more thing about this guy that is the most fascinating thing. Oh, here's another picture of him. Happy looking dude. Frederick the Wise of Saxony. Now, Prince Frederick, as I call him. One more thing about him. And it's a weird thing, but it's really important. He's an avid collector of relics. Okay. If you don't know what relics are pieces of church history. So the bones of St. Peter, or a splinter from the cross of Christ. If you travel the world, you'll see these in some big, huge, wealthy churches. And these relics are held closely by the church at large in the world. And people go to see them and to touch them, to get close to them. And there's literally hundreds of thousands of different relics in the world. But Prince Frederick, sorry, I've got a bunch of kids over here playing in the background. Ignore that. Prince Frederick is an avid collector of relics, and he's been able to come into control of some like very famous relics. One of them is one that he claims is one of the thorns from Christ's crown, on the crown of thorns on his head. Another one, he apparently has the thumb of Saint Anne. Gross. And he has a collection of all kinds of stuff like that. And so he collects more and more and more of these things, and he's growing in wealth, and he's refurbishing the churches for people coming to see these things, and they're donating money to see these. And he gains so many, he ends up by around 1516, 1517, he's got about 19,000 relics in his possession. And every year he has a bit of a relic festival, right? Where he sets these things all up in the church, and he displays these relics and in rows, and people come on a pilgrimage from all over the world to see these relics. And when they come, they also bring money, wealth. They donate to the church. They give offerings. They come from all over the world to walk up and down the aisles and to venerate these relics. Now, this is a common misconception about how Protestants think about Catholics. They say Protestants will sometimes say things like, well, they worship Mary. They don't worship Mary. It's called venerating Mary. It's holding in reverence and awe and wonder and pondering in meditation the role that God used them, the role that God had them in, okay? And the role that these particular things played, whoever these things were attached to. We actually have several pages from a book that was kept on file and on display at this big display of the 19,000 relics that he had. Here's a picture of one of the pages. I don't read German, especially not like archaic German, but here you go. These are some of the pictures of the relics, and the whole book was filled with 19,000 sort of relics with detailed descriptions and the part that they played in the church. Now, it was believed that when you came to venerate these objects, these relics, according to the church, the veneration of these relics could win you indulgences. If you were venerating them, you would get indulgences. And there was specific measurements attached to different ones. And so this wasn't just entertainment. This wasn't just a museum that people were coming to see, okay? In fact, 100 days of indulgences. So in other words, it'll get you out of purgatory 100 days earlier if you would venerate one of the relics. That's how many indulgences you could get, 100 days worth of indulgences. So 100 days of indulgences was won by venerating a single fragment in the collection. And I have here, and additional indulgences for each aisle that they passed through. And there was 19 aisles in all. Now, if you do the math on this, a pious pilgrim who traveled from the other side of Germany and who came into Wittenberg and spent a couple of days venerating the objects, the relics, could earn almost 2 million days of indulgences for a deceased loved one whom they had lost during the plague. Okay? What we have here is a perfect storm of all these things coming together, surrounding the idea of indulgences, because what happens is Johann Tetzel, do I have more here? Yeah, okay. So Johann Tetzel, let me go back to him. Johann Tetzel, he enters into Saxony and he starts selling indulgences. And the indulgences that he is selling are literally hurting the business of the relics of Frederick the Wise. All right. And so we have a conflict of, I guess, capitalistic interests, if you will. And these two are at odds with each other. And so what you end up with is these two guys are fighting over money, the money of the poor, who are trying to save loved ones from who they believe are suffering and burning in purgatory. And Prince Frederick is losing money. And Johann Tetzel's traveling around, and he's selling indulgences to people who Prince Frederick thinks should be down at his chapel, donating money there and buying indulgences from him. And so they're undercutting each other, right? And so Prince Frederick makes a decree and basically kicks Tetzel out of Saxony, tells him, you cannot sell indulgences here. Go across the border. So Tetzel runs across the border. It's by law, he has to now. And he sets up shop just on the other side of the border, I think on the other side of the river there. And he is selling indulgences. And it's not stopping the flow of money that is leaving Saxony. All the money's going to Rome, and it's being split between the Archbishop and the Pope. And Prince Frederick doesn't know what to do. He can't stop the loss, the bleeding of money, the bloodletting that is leaving his territory and his power and his grasp. And so he needs someone that he can partner with that can end indulgences. Now maybe you're seeing what's going on here. There's a reason why nobody cared about indulgences before. And suddenly everybody seems to care about indulgences now when Luther does this. And the reason is very simple. Because powerful, wealthy, rich people suddenly stand to lose some money. And so they take the theological teachings of the everyday church leader and theologian, and they weaponize them for power and money and gain. Perhaps you've heard this before. Perhaps you've seen this play out in the world and in life. It's playing out every day and has been playing out since the rise of Constantine. It's playing out right now in our own country, and in other countries it's playing out. Powerful, wealthy people who stand to financially gain power and influence from the manipulation of theology. And so Prince Frederick understands that there's this professor in his district, Martin Luther, who is preaching against indulgences, like all kinds of theologians have in his day and all kinds of preachers have. And this time, some interesting things happen. He posts this thing on the door. Someone else gets a copy of this thing and sends it to the archbishop as, like, I don't know if it's a warning or what, or if it was somebody that is friends with the archbishop. And then someone else, and we don't know who, takes Luther's thesis, which was written in German, and they translate it into, it was written in Greek, but it was written in Greek, and they translate it into German, and they make copies of it, broadsheets, and they send them all over Germany as if to rile up the people and change public perception about indulgences to the church. Because if Prince Frederick can do away with the sale of indulgences, he will stop bleeding money, and he will maintain his power, and he will stop the spread of the archbishop into his territory, and he will stand to actually keep financially benefiting from his own display of relics. Are you with me? It's a lot happening. And so he partners with Luther. And like we know, if you read Luther, I encourage you, let me show you, hold on. Let me grab something for you. Okay. I'm always showing books and encouraging books. Here's volume 1 of a guy, Martin Brecht, wrote a very thick book on Luther. This is the beginning of his life, and then book 2 is on the middle, and book 3 is like sort of on the end. Beautiful, brilliant book on Luther. If you want to know more about this kind of stuff, about sort of a lot of it's not just him. There's a lot of other books that you can read as well. If you want more sources on this, I can easily, I can send out the essay. Actually, if you want to email me, tommy@watermarktampa.com, if you'd like to read the essay. It's, I think, 15 pages I wrote on this. And if you'd like to read the essay I wrote on this, I'll send it. It's got all the primary sources, all the texts, all the quotes, including some, like, a lot deeper dive into some of these things. But basically, history tells us that the Reformation would not have taken place and would not have been successful had it not, well, Luther's Reformation, without Frederick the Wise backing Luther. It's no coincidence that Prince Frederick backed Luther. It was financially good for him to do so. At one point after the Diet of Worms, he basically keeps Luther safe through that. Jan Hus didn't survive when the Pope called him in. They burned him alive, and that's likely what was about to happen to Luther. But they let him escape because they promised him, we're not going to kill you. We just want to hear you and hear you disavow these books. And so he stands up there and he doesn't disavow his books. He takes him about a day to make this decision, but he decides, no, these are my writings and I'm not going to recant these. These are my writings. but they didn't burn him alive. But later on, they sent some people out to arrest him. And Friedrich knows about this. And so Friedrich actually sends some of his own soldiers to kidnap Luther on his way back, come out of the woods. They kidnap Luther and they take him to, oh, I've got more pictures. They take him to the Wartburg Castle, where he writes his Bible translation, where he does some other work where he's sort of hidden there, takes under a pseudonym, a fake name, and writes all kinds of theology from there. The whole way along the way, Frederick is protecting Luther. And eventually, once sort of Frederick had made the money that he wanted to make, he sort of slowly lets go of the sale of indulgences over the whole next decade. But everyone else, basically the sale of indulgences kind of comes to a screeching halt when the Reformation kind of takes off, as people start to realize this. And Frederick kind of had to act like he was against indulgences, but instead of stopping them right away, he slowly trails them off over the next decade, right? So as to not financially kill him so bad, and he sort of gets into other ways of making money. But this is the Wartburg Castle, where that was under his jurisdiction, that he took him and hid him out at, and took care of him the whole way through. So like this story, it's almost like it would have been a miracle for a Reformation not to happen. Like they were just looking for somebody that they could use to stop the Pope from taking money from them. And it's not that like, I don't look on this as like this thing to like, see, it wasn't a big deal. It's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. You can kind of see like, despite the efforts of powerful people to keep things the way they were, God was already working in the minds of the people, the everyday people, ministers, the everyday pastors, for a long time. They had been writing about these issues for a long time. And it took sort of, in order for their theology to even be heard and seen, it took powerful people losing money. And I guess there's some lessons to be learned there. I think whenever history is being written, it's because there's a revolution. I think right now history is being written. I think a lot of powerful people are now suddenly being forced to listen to people at the bottom, who have been saying the same thing for a very, very long time. And all kinds of people are just now being forced to wake up to it. All right. And the idea that Luther purposefully though launched a Reformation to separate from the church, that's not true. Like Luther was devout. He loved the church. If it was his will, he would have stayed in and reformed it. But the Reformation, it kind of failed because it didn't necessarily reform the Catholic Church. They had to reform themselves later once it hurt enough. That's how it always is, right? Once it takes stuff to hurt enough for people to reform stuff. But I think what Luther was trying to do is just be a good pastor and talk about issues that I think he was like, one day we're going to have to deal with this. Little did he know, they were going to have to deal with it there. So for me, that is one of the most fascinating stories of the whole Reformation. I think movies should be made about this. And anyone who's watching this, who's a movie maker, I'd love to help you write that script. Yeah, that's that. That is today's, I guess that was a short lesson. I purposely shortened it down because I thought it was going to go way longer, but it didn't. Any questions about that? Did I confuse anybody on any of those points? Any of those thoughts there? If you're watching on Facebook, I can't see the chat, so sorry. You're just a fly on the wall watching this. But if you go to Watermark Tampa, you can hop in and hop on the chat here with us. Any thoughts on that at all? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any sort of other questions related to this kind of thing that you have? What's everybody eating for lunch? I had jambalaya with hot sauce, and my wife made it, and she makes the best. What is our place in the Reformation? Ooh, that's a good question, Michaela. Um, every one of us has a place in it. I mean, the slogan used to be always reforming, right? Like, we should always be reforming. As academia moves forward, as we learn new things, we should adjust. I think it should move slowly. I think oftentimes when we, it's interesting because when you see Paul's conversion, what was Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus? I'm actually preaching about that this week. That's why it's fresh on my brain. Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. It wasn't this. It wasn't this thing where like he converted from one religion to another and like someone convinced him to leave his religion and go to another religion from Judaism and Christianity. That's not what it was. If anything, he just moved from one sect of Judaism to another because the early Christians were considered Jewish. What happened was he got a new piece of information and it threw a wrench in his gears and it locked everything up. And he could no longer like function the way he was. Okay. And so he has two different reactions to this. The first thing he does is he charges in, he runs to the synagogues, and he starts like telling everybody, oh, I've had a vision, and it turns out there's a human being sitting on the throne of the universe, of the cosmos, and it's Jesus of Nazareth, whom I've been persecuting. This one fact changes his entire idea. And it's sort of like he doesn't know what to do with it, so he hasn't processed it. And so this thing causes like this faith crisis in Paul. And the first thing he does is he runs around trying to enlighten everyone else. And this is what we always do. We learn something new, and we run around trying to light everybody else up, right? You read an article online, and suddenly you're an expert. And then you run out there and start yelling at everybody and telling them they're stupid for not knowing what you know, what you just learned last week. And what happens is Paul does this, and it doesn't go well, and they try to kill him, and the Christians are rejecting him too because they're terrified of him because he was just trying to kill them. And so it doesn't feel genuine. And eventually, the Christians are talked by Barnabas into accepting him, and the Christians send him home. They're like, hey, go home. And he's gone for like 10 years before he really starts his ministry. Like, and what Paul does is like he sits in his theology, and he tries it out for all. He like lives in it. He becomes a tent maker. He gets a job. He leaves the ministry. He gets a job, like a low-end job, tent maker. And he just tries to live it out. And when he finds it, it changes his life, and it breathes life into him. And he works out his theology, and then he sets off into the world to live it and teach other people to live it. Right? Like, so our point in Reformation, when we learn something new, is not to charge out and make a giant ruckus, although sometimes it's important. Like, I think we're called Protestants for a reason. I think protests are really important. I take part in them regularly. But blasting people, not helpful. I think some of Luther's writings where he's insulting and dehumanizing the Pope, I don't think some of that was helpful. His later writings where he was virulently anti-Semitic, obviously not helpful. But it's funny, you look back and God used all these super flawed people to do amazing things, to bring us to where we are now. And we better realize that we are flawed too, and that God is bringing things into our life that are changing our minds, and we should receive them. We should sit with them. We should try them on. We should live them. You don't just take theology and believe it. You live it. And so lived theology is what Paul's doing. Systematic theology is not what he's doing. He's lived theology. And so that's what we should be doing. We take part in the Reformation all the time. We change ourselves. We change our communities. That branches out. New communities will be formed. Next generation of communities will rise up. They will be changed. This is how the Reformation continues. I've said this before in these church history for lunches. I do believe one day, the church will reunite. I think we will all keep reforming and come to the conclusion one day that we are all one church. That our Catholics are our brothers and sisters, that our Greek Orthodox are our brothers and sisters. Pentecostals, Reformed, New Perspective, Calvinists, like they're all Southern Baptists, our brothers and sisters. And I think there will come a day, I don't see it soon, when we will all begin to see the same thing. That's part of the journey. It's part of the process. That's what I see. And I think the evidence I have for that is that sort of the evidence of history, where we've come from. There's been a lot of division, but God always tends to bring people back together, closer together again. Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions about any of this? Anything? Oh, I heard somebody. Someone took a breath like they were going to talk.
You said the
There
Catholic.
we go.
You said the Catholic Church had their own Reformation. Are you referring to the Counter-Reformation? And if so, could you talk a little bit about that?
I don't have time for that, dude. That's like massive. No, yeah, I mean, over the years, like they've all kinds of it. Like there was a time when the Catholic Church was incredibly violent. There was a time when the Catholic Church was authoritarian, brutalistic sort of dictatorship of the world. They have been reforming for centuries.
Yeah.
And you know, some of it, you get right down to like Vatican I, Vatican II. Some of it is it's always, you know, when people reform, it's when they when there's a crisis. So I think it was Vatican II that was against. It might have been Vatican I, but that was against modernism, like modernity. And because they're reacting to sort of the liberal Protestant claims that of like the what's called the demythologization of the text, where like people trying to say that, you know, Bultmann and stuff saying that like the miraculous things were all added in later. That's just not true. The early church believed in the miraculous things. They believed that they happened, and you can't rewrite that and say that they didn't believe they happened, because they did. And so the Catholic Church is sort of like pushing back against any kind of demythologization of the text. I'm probably saying that wrong. And so it's, as the church always is, always confronting and reforming. And the church is always growing. The church is always expanding. When I was a kid, there was a massive conversation about divorce. Divorced people weren't allowed in the church. And now they have a regular part to play. And we've come to see that God is including them. So like God is working, God is moving and changing. Yeah. Let's see, what else? I had some other thoughts I wrote down. I don't remember what they were. I think I'm just going to end it there. I think that's good for today. I think next time, 2 weeks from now, we're going to get back into the 1st and 2nd centuries. We're going to go back to sort of the patristic fathers. I'm not sure when we're going to get to Origen. He might be next. But yeah, join us then as well. And we'll pull out more fascinating figures of church history and talk about that. So everybody, it's good to see you all. I hope quarantine is treating you well. And see you next time.
See you then.
Later.